Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. We need to have a long overdue conversation about the real salt of the earth. No, not the folks who you see Hollywood presenting to you or in country music videos. I'm talking about the true people of the soil. This is going to make you mad when you hear about it, but if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. Joe Biden's been in office for going on 2.5 years now. He promised billions of dollars in relief for black farmers. He even made a promise that he would use money from the COVID relief fund to help these black farmers who have been the most neglected farmers in the world. But all it took was a couple of conservative racists who no doubt work for these agricultural consortiums to file a lawsuit, and Biden immediately backtracked on his promise and said that the money would go to farmers in general regardless of color. And please don't kid yourself that this wasn't Biden's plan from the jump. Everyone knows that when you make pledges to do something for black people, there will inevitably be some anti-black racist who comes out to try to challenge it in court. And by the way, as we've seen in recent years, a large number of these anti-black racists are not white. And rather than fight these nuisance suits, Biden instead used that as his excuse to do what he wanted to do from the beginning, which was to walk away and say, well, there's just nothing I can do. Now, we all know that when it comes to government support for farmers, it's not based on need at all, but based on race. Black people are allegedly 13% of the population, but we're only 1.3% of America's farmers. 100 years ago, that number was 14%. What that means is that 1 out of every black farmers in the U.S. was black a century ago. And we're not talking about a couple of postage stamp-sized sharecropper plots either. 100 years ago, black families owned nearly 20 million acres of farmland. And that was the largest amount of black farmland that we would ever have. By the end of the 20th century, anti-black racist policies took 90% of that land away from us. According to the white media, they estimate that the loss of wealth and income to the black families could amount to at least $326 billion. But that's an estimate from the white media, so you know the real number has to be at least 20 times that much. But I point this out because you always have some anti-black racist like that Variswamy creep who was on CNN the other day saying that black people unquestionably have equal rights in America and nobody's depriving us of anything and that black people are not being targeted at all. We had more land 100 years ago than we have today. And we lost 90% of it in the last 100 years. And that decline hasn't stopped. It's still ongoing. And that's not a failure of black people to acquire or hold on to land. It's exactly the opposite. This is a deliberate, intentional policy from the government and private business working together to disenfranchise us specifically. The government, along with collusion from agribusiness and vicious anti-black racist farmers, has whittled the number of black farmers down to nearly nothing. Even so, for the U.S. government, that's still too many. In 2020, the Trump administration committed $26 billion to assist farmers, but only about 0.1% went to black farmers. In 2020, the Department of Agriculture gave loans to 71% of white applicants who wanted them. So if you were a white farmer who wanted government money, there was a greater than 7 out of 10 chance you'd get it. On the other hand, if you were a black farmer, there was only about a 1 in 3 chance that you would get the money. And keep in mind, the amounts of money for white applicants versus black applicants was radically different. And the Biden administration has continued this practice. Joe Biden claimed to have put a provision in his 2021 relief package that would have been earmarked for black farmers. At least that's what he said publicly. But he only did that to get some quickie headlines. After all, he had just taken office, so he wanted to appear like he was actually doing something for black people. But he knew that as soon as the press conference was over and that the cameras were gone, nobody would really be taking note of whether or not he actually kept his promise. Tragically, a lot of black farmers did listen to Biden. They bought into the lies that he told, along with his black DNC puppets like the ones you see on TV and these online puppet accounts, many of whom aren't even black people, by the way. Now, I don't blame the black farmers for listening because of the fact that they're desperate. These people have been under siege for over 100 years. They're trying to save their family farms. So many of them who made the mistake of believing Biden's lies that he wanted to help them, they actually went into debt trying to make those investments into their farms because they were anticipating that Biden would keep his word. But then on cue, the white right inevitably and predictably filed some nuisance lawsuits claiming that this constituted racial discrimination or whatever. And as for Biden, He didn't even try to maintain the earmarked money. Instead, he immediately repealed the money last year as part of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And you don't see Democrats saying a word about it either, do you? None of them saying, hey, Biden promised money to black farmers. We're going to come through for you. Just hang in there. We're trying to work on it. Nope. Out of sight, out of mind. He ain't talking about it. Now, I want you to remember that. That was one of the provisions that the Democrats put into the Inflation Reduction Act. So when you hear Biden or Elizabeth Warren or Karine Stank-Pierre or the congressional black talkers or anybody in the white media talking about how great the Inflation Reduction Act was and how it did all these great things for America, just remember one of the great things that it did was to take all the money the black farmers were supposed to get and say, well, now you're not going to get it. Whenever somebody mentions the Inflation Reduction Act, you make sure you tell them part of what they reduced was the money the black farmers were supposed to get. They didn't just reduce it, they eliminated it. Biden wasn't worried about how much he had promised to black farmers because he knew that the conservatives would predictably attack it in court. And for all we know, Biden and the Democrats probably coordinated with them behind the scenes to carry out this legal smokescreen. Keep in mind that both Democrats and Republicans had no problem passing a gay marriage law at the federal level in record time last year. And they did this immediately after the contentious 2022 midterms, which lets you know that they had been putting their heads together to get that done for months before it actually came to a vote in Congress. They never seem to have any problems passing laws and getting bipartisan support for everyone except us. And has Biden even admitted to his failure to come through on his promise for black farmers? Of course not, because he didn't fail at all. What happened was all part of the plan. And yet online, you're going to be seeing Democratic shills, many of them foreign-born, by the way, who will get on the internet and claim that Biden did this for black people and he did that for black people. These are DNC sock puppet shills. These people sound just like moron DeSantis whenever he talks about his asinine legislation. Almost all of it's been struck down by the courts. And the same thing goes for Biden's so-called policies for black people. Most of that stuff never actually happened. Oh, there was lots of attention given to his proposals, but then, of course, inevitably they were either greatly reduced or just eliminated altogether. Next time some DNC plant calls themselves telling you what Biden allegedly did for black people, you make sure to remind them of this. Now, I find that when talking about anti-black racist policies, that it helps to give case studies so that people can understand how these policies work in practice. So here's a couple for you. John Wesley Boyd Jr. is a farmer in West Virginia. He has over 1,500 acres of land that his family has tilled since slavery. They've faced all manner of racism for decades. A loan officer once spat tobacco juice on Mr. Boyd. The loan officer claimed that he accidentally missed the spit can. Another time, Boyd saw an official tear up his loan application and throw it in the trash. But of course, the anti-black racism wasn't just limited to the financial institutions. When Mr. Boyd tried to sell his crops, he faced blatant racism there too. John Boyd tried to sell a load of soybeans, and he was offered a pitifully low price for it on the grounds that there was moisture in the load, or that there was trash, or some other flimsy excuse. And then his wife was sent to sell a load from the exact same field, and she was offered a better price. But his wife's stepfather, who was a white man, took a load of soybeans from that same field to sell, and predictably he was told that they were the best beans that the buyer had ever seen, and was asked could he bring more of them. So what it comes down to is, when black farmers show up, especially black men, they're told, oh, this ain't good enough altogether. This is a deliberate policy of disenfranchising black people in general, but they seem to have a particular anger and a particular antipathy toward black men. It's a matter of, we got to make sure the black man in particular is targeted, that he's not going to be producing anything. This is meant to undermine his authority and his ability to be the leader in his community. But it was the U.S. Department of Agriculture where Mr. Boyd would face his fiercest discrimination. In 1996, the USDA tried to take Mr. Boyd's family farm. Now, typically the government, especially the federal government, takes months, if not years, to do anything because of bureaucracy. And yet, in the case of Mr. Boyd, it only took the USDA 30 days to foreclose on his land. And the USDA moved to immediately auction off the remaining 110 acres. They were trying to liquidate his estate as quickly as possible. The same United States government who is infamous for taking years, if not decades, to move on things like environmental issues, especially in Flint. And yet the USDA moved faster than a commercial bank to take a black farmer's land. In fact, there are direct ties between the USDA and local racists who actually carry out these foreclosures. John Boyd joined a group of other black farmers in the late 90s who led a protest in D.C. over how they were being treated. The then Agricultural Secretary declared a farm foreclosure moratorium. That gave Mr. Boyd the time to save his family farm. But internal documents from the USDA's own internal review confirmed the routine racism that black farmers like Mr. Boyd face. Even though the USDA's state director explicitly instructed that Mr. Boyd's operating loan requests be processed, the requests still were not processed for years. They just sat on those loan requests for years doing nothing with them. Keep in mind, this was the exact same USDA that only needed 30 days to foreclose on Mr. Boyd's farm. And then after that, Mr. Boyd's account was improperly referred to a credit bureau as delinquent. That meant they sent it out for collections, when it was supposed to have been restructured. This put even harder financial difficulties on Mr. Boyd and his family. Isn't it amazing how that keeps working out? Just mistake after mistake, allegedly. The USDA's state agency director says that this man's paperwork needs to be processed. Well, they just sit on it for years. Not days, not weeks, not months, but years they sit on it. Oh, this man's account, it's supposed to be restructured so that we can get this guy back on the right track and make sure they keep his farm. Instead, no, let's go ahead and send it out for collections. Let's go ahead and take it from him. Now, when you see this stuff happening over and over and over again, but only to farmers who are black, and you see them just giving lie after lie, oh, well, we said to process your paperwork, but they didn't do it for years, and well, your account was supposed to be restructured, but instead they sent it out as delinquent. When that stuff happens over and over again, that means you're being lied to, and they just want to see whether or not you're going to continue to play along with it, or if you're going to finally call them on it. And unlike white farmers, when black farmers fall behind on a payment, the USDA immediately accelerates prosecution of the loan. What that means is they tell the black farmers you only got 30 days to pay the loan in full. No negotiations. That's what they do to black farmers. You fall behind on a payment, they say, well, now the entire loan is due. They don't do that with white farmers. And if you can't pay, which none of them can because unlike white farmers, black farmers are denied the money they need to operate their farms profitably, the USDA then demands that the black farmers enter into a so-called program that the USDA claims will allow the farmers to buy back their land after their financial situation improves. But of course, that never happens because the USDA has so-called local county committees who are given first dibs on the black farmers' land as soon as it's confiscated. Predictably, these USDA county committees are comprised entirely of white farmers. And as John Boyd recounts, one of the white farmers who was on the USDA county committee where he lives took 46 acres of Mr. Boyd's tobacco farm back in 1996. So you got the guys who are on these committees, who are the ones orchestrating these foreclosures, and then taking the land for themselves. Another case is that of Theodore Bates. His family bought a homestead in 1970 with a commercial loan. The USDA's Farm Loan Agency refused to so much as give the Bates an application to fill out. Mr. Bates said that he later learned the reason they didn't want to give him an application was because they didn't want it to be documented that they discriminated against a black applicant. So they opted to lie and just not give Bates an application form at all. The 1980s brought tough weather to the heartland, which is where the Bates farm was located. There was a drought one year, a late freeze another, and then a hailstorm that wiped out the Bates farm's wheat crop. Now, while white farmers were being given loans and subsidies and all the governmental aid they needed, black farmers like the Bates got nothing. As a result, the lender who held the deed on the family farm was able to foreclose on them. I say able to foreclose on them because that was part of the plan. In 2012, Elvin D. Keiswetter, the former president of the Credit Association who foreclosed on the Bates farm, gave a sworn affidavit in which he admitted there had been a plan to get the Bates, quote, out of farming. Keiswetter himself testified that the board of the Credit Association decided they would rather foreclose on the Bates property, even if that meant the bank took a loss, rather than take the Bates family money, regardless of if it was paid on the notes. That was the former president of the bank who said that in a sworn affidavit. And this wasn't back in the 1920s or 30s. This was just 9 years ago. He testified that the board of the bank that he was the president of was intentionally targeting a black farmer to take his land from him, that they didn't want the money, they just wanted him out of the farming business. This wasn't about cash. This was about race. You remember that when some idiot tells you, oh man, it's not about black and white, it's about green. No, it's about black and white. The bank who had been targeting the Bates family took their machinery, then their land. The Bates family could only watch as the sheriff cut the locks to the Bates family's grain stores, and then they endured hour after excruciating hour as trucks hauled away the grain that their family had grown and harvested. The family was financially ruined. They had to go on food stamps afterwards. When Mr. Bates' father found out that the farm had been taken from them, he died the following Sunday. Theodore Bates himself died back in January of 2022. While Biden was still stringing black farmers along with lies about how he was going to try to help them. The Bates family were out of the farming business all right, because they were targeted and their lives ruined by racists in the USDA, the banks, and local farmers. Now that account that I just related to you happened back in 1986. This is what's been done to black farmers. And it wasn't just in the last few years, or even in the 1990s, or even the 80s. It's been going on since the end of chattel slavery. How is it that black people coming out of chattel slavery were able to acquire tens of millions of acres of land, and then over the course of several decades, all of it was taken, all of it wound up being given to banks or to otherwise to white interests? The loss of black land didn't happen here or there. It happened across the board like a flood. These were deliberate confiscatory policies based on race. It wasn't some unfortunate happenstance, and it wasn't the result of mismanagement of the farm. It was the result of deliberate, intentional governmental policy at the county, state, and federal levels. The loss of all that black land wasn't some unintended consequence of the bureaucracy. It was the entire point of the bureaucracy, working exactly the way it was designed. You got crooks in charge because that's how the U.S. government's set up. The USDA is a criminal racket, operating as nothing more than a land appropriation committee for racist white supremacists. These are racially predatory practices being carried out by the U.S. government, and it doesn't take much imagination to figure out that these so-called conservative groups who file these lawsuits to block the aid to black farmers are without doubt the same racists who use their position to steal the black farmers' land. Unless you're doing subsistence farming, it is impossible to run a large-scale farm operation without outside funding, due to the size of the land and the demands of doing factory farming. White farmers get all the help they want, and nobody challenges that help. Nobody says, whoa, they're getting way more help than they're supposed to be getting based on proportion. Nobody sits there and says this is racially discriminatory. Nobody does that. And also, you don't see the USDA rushing to shut down white farms at lightning speed. The Biden administration doesn't do that. Who in the government is suing based on these lopsided outcomes? Nobody. By the way, you remember how John Boyd and those black farmers protested in 1996? Who was the president then? Yeah, Bill Clinton. And of course, it wasn't just him. What did Obama do for black farmers? Nothing. He was too busy supporting everybody else. Anti-black racism, this anything but benign neglect, is a bipartisan issue. Both political parties carry it out. Black farmers could not have been systematically shut out like they have been without both political parties actively and intentionally working together to push a policy of racial exclusion. And you can tell because of how utterly consistent that policy has been, the absolute continuity of policy that crosses bipartisan lines and goes across Republican and Democratic administrations. Now, there's a lot of Negroes you see who say, we don't need money, we need land. Why, the money, that dollar could be devalued tomorrow. Well, my question to them is this. When you see white people demanding compensation, how many of them say that they don't want money? None of them does. They say they want money because they can use that to get whatever they need. Now, for the people who don't like to listen very closely, I'm not saying that land is a bad thing, but I need some of the people who have become attached to that talking point to stop being so emotionally wedded to something you heard a long time ago and just can't let go of. Is land important? Of course it is. Though you're wrong if you see land as the foundation of reparations. Land can be part of an overall reparations package, sure, but the foundation is money. Because as we saw with Bruce's Beach, even if you do get land, and even if that land is in an economically desirous location, unless you have the ability to develop that land and make it generate income for you, it won't be your land for very long. Land only becomes wealth when there's significant human activity occurring on top of it. Otherwise, it's just a patch of dirt. That's the reason why in Dr. King's now famous statement about "we're coming to get our check," he gave a brief rundown of just a few of the things the U.S. government did to give white peasants from Europe land, but then, as Dr. King explained, the government went way beyond that by giving these newly minted white landowners an education in farming, and then gave them governmental money to mechanize and subsidize their farms. Land alone is not enough. Those black farmers are not saying that they don't have land. They're saying that they're being deprived of the means to make their farms productive. Means that white farmers get automatically and that these black farmers are shut out of. And then they have these white supremacists threatening their lives. A number of black farmers have had their lives threatened by their so-called neighbors. And where's the FBI while all this is going on? Well, they're doing the same thing that the USDA did when it was sitting on its hands, not giving black farmers any assistance. They only move when they see an opportunity to deprive a black person of their life or their land. Now, this is what's being done to black farmers right now, and all of you who told us to vote for Biden because he was going to do something, I hope you'll stop hiding and take credit for this. It's as much your fault as his. Biden's racist calculation is clear. He thinks that since only about 1.3% of black Americans are farmers, then the lies he's told will only alienate him from about 1.3% of black voters. Apparently, he thinks that's the only percentage of black people who his lies will matter to. He thinks that since black farmers as a group don't have much numbers, they can't make him pay for the lies he's told, so it doesn't matter. He'll never have to pay a political price. And he would be right if we only focused on the farmer part. But we are the black grassroots. We're focused on the black part. This is just another in an endless string of broken promises from that wrinkled up racist. And he has the nerve to think he's going to get black support next year? It is our job to make sure that all the thefts and destroyed dreams and ruined lives of black people are remembered. When Biden gets his re-election underway and we see the same old bootlicks trotted out to tell us the same old lies, we have to make sure to remind people of the truth. Now, to be sure, you're probably not going to get many opportunities to confront Biden. They're already keeping this guy pretty much under lock and key. That's because Biden's brain, such as it is basically the consistency of warm Jell-O at this point. So don't expect them to let him do any talking, certainly not to us. In fact, I wouldn't even bet on Karine Stank-Pierre giving any sort of statements on it. They're going to want to stay as far away from something like this as possible. They might trot out Barack Obama to make an appearance, but he'll be simply doing the same old splaining. Nobody else gives a damn about the injustices that we've had inflicted on us, so it's up to us to care. This is why we're owed reparations. Not just because of the loss of income and the stress and the indignation that's been visited on the Boyd and Bates families, but because of all of the wealth that they were deprived of for generations and generations. They have not been treated as citizens. And this is the federal government that did it to them. We're not talking about 500 years ago or 150 years ago. We're talking about in the last couple of decades. Things like black farmers being deprived of the funding that they're entitled to, having their land stolen from them, mass incarceration, redlining. These are not things that stopped happening in the 1950s or what have you. These are not things from a bygone era. This is stuff going on right now, all the way up to the present. And this is all just part of the 1,000,001 reasons why we're owed reparations. For all of you out there who obsess over land as reparations, this is a subject you ought to be leading the charge on. You ought to make sure you repeat it every chance you get, especially over the course of the next 18 months. When Election Day comes next year, we're going to put Biden and the Republicans on notice that black people have not forgotten what they've done. And we are determined to make sure they reap what they've sown. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Divine Lady, Sherman Marshall, Wesley Monroe, Tamara Chandler, and Enduro Emblem. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.